Domestication is not something humans did to animals. It is something animals did to us. You are standing in the flickering orange glow of a campfire 40 millennia ago, and the creature sitting just beyond the light isn't a captive, but a volunteer. This one-line reality upends everything we think we know about our own history. We like to imagine ourselves as the masters of the wild, the clever engineers who bent the natural world to our will through sheer force and ingenuity. We picture an ancient ancestor snatching a wolf pup from a den or lassoing a wild horse, initiating a grand plan to build a civilization. But the deeper we look into the genetic record and the silent testimony of the earth, the more that image dissolves into a self-flattering myth. The truth is far more accidental, far more dangerous, and infinitely more strange. It's a paradox of survival where the very creatures we think we tamed actually manipulated us into providing for them, and in doing so, they fundamentally rewrote the human genome and the trajectory of our species. We didn't invent domestication. We fell into it. Why didn't this process kill us before it began? Every species we now consider domestic started as a lethal threat or a skittish shadow in the brush. To understand how we survived this collision, we have to dismantle the first great lie of history, the great tamer myth. Most people believe domestication was a conscious choice, a technology we invented like the wheel or the spear. But biological reality tells a different story. If you try to tame a wild-born adult wolf today, you will likely end up in an emergency room. Their socialization window closes so early in development that by the time they can walk, they are already hardwired to see you as either a predator or a rival. The idea that a nomadic hunter-gatherer, someone living on the edge of starvation, would waste precious meat and safety on a volatile, bone-crushing carnivore is a romantic fantasy. It makes no sense from a survival standpoint. The risk-to-reward ratio is entirely skewed toward the risk. Then there's the biological wall. Not every animal can be domesticated, no matter how hard you try. Evolutionary biologist Jared Diamond famously outlined the Anna Karenina principle for domestication. All domesticable animals are alike, but every undomesticable animal is undomesticable in its own way. To be a candidate, a species needs a very specific set of traits. It needs a flexible diet, a fast growth rate, the ability to breed in captivity, a predictable temperament, and most importantly, a social hierarchy that humans can hijack. If a species panics in an enclosure, like a gazelle, or takes 15 years to reach maturity, like an elephant, it's a non-starter. This means the invention of domestication was actually a massive, multi-millennial filter. We were essentially waiting for the right mutations to show up in the right places at the right time. But even with the right candidates, the initial contact should have been a bloodbath. If you look at the ancestors of our modern cows, the aurochs, you're looking at a 2,000-pound wall of muscle and aggression. Julius Caesar wrote that they were nearly the size of elephants and would kill anything that moved. How do you go from that to a dairy cow? The answer isn't that we conquered them. It's that a very small, very specific group of them realized that being near us was a better survival strategy than being away from us. It was a high-stakes gamble where the losers were eaten and the winners became our partners. It makes you wonder what else was lurking in those early camps that didn't make the cut. The first step toward the modern world wasn't a fence, but a pile of trash. Long before we were farmers, we were mess makers. Hunter-gatherer camps were effectively high-calorie beacons in a low-calorie world. Every time an ancient group butchered a kill, they left behind scraps, marrow-heavy bones, gristle, and internal organs that humans found difficult to digest but that a wolf found life-saving. This created what archaeologists call the commensal pathway. Think of it as a natural selection experiment running on autopilot. The wolves that were hyper-aggressive toward humans were killed. The ones that were hyper-fearful never got close enough to eat. But a third group emerged, the bold but calm individuals. They could tolerate the smell and sound of humans without triggering a fight-or-flight response. These calm wolves ate better than their wilder cousins. They survived the winter, and they passed those calm genes to their offspring. This wasn't a human decision. It was the wolves domesticating themselves to fit a new niche, the human-adjacent niche. Research by evolutionary anthropologist Brian Hare at Duke University suggests this survival of the friendliest is the secret engine of domestication. Over generations, these animals didn't just change their behavior, their bodies began to change as well. This is the domestication syndrome. When you select for tameness, you aren't just getting a nicer animal, you are inadvertently triggering a cascade of physical shifts: floppy ears, curly tails, shorter snouts, and white patches in the fur. This happens because the cells that govern the fight-or-flight response, the neural crest cells, also contribute to the development of ears, muzzles, and coat color. By choosing the animal that didn't bite, we were accidentally choosing the animal with the floppy ears and the spotted coat. We were building a companion without even knowing what a companion was. It was a biological feedback loop that neither species understood. And once those friendly wolves were integrated into the camp, the game changed for humans too. They weren't just eating our trash anymore, they were our alarm systems. They could hear and smell predators, bears, lions, rival tribes, long before any human could. A camp with proto-dogs was a camp that didn't get ambushed. This created a secondary selection pressure. Humans began to favor the presence of these animals because they made the humans more likely to survive. It was a mutual contract signed in blood and leftovers. But that still doesn't explain why we didn't just stop at dogs. If dogs gave us safety, why did we decide to bring the rest of the animal kingdom inside the wire? The transition from hunting to herding is usually framed as a eureka moment, but it was actually a slow-motion collapse of the old way of life. Around 12,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, the planet's climate became wildly unpredictable. The megafauna, the mammoths and giant sloths that humans had relied on for millennia, were disappearing. Humans were forced to settle down near reliable water sources and stands of wild grain. This is where the prey pathway begins. Imagine a group of people in the Zagros Mountains of modern-day Iran. They've been hunting wild goats for generations. But as the climate shifts and human populations grow, hunting becomes less reliable. You can't just follow the herd anymore, you need to make sure the herd is there when you need it. So, you start making small, almost imperceptible changes. You stop killing the pregnant females. You start culling the young, aggressive males first. You begin to follow the herd not as a predator, but as a shadow. Archaeologist Melinda Zetter, who has spent decades studying this transition at sites like Ganj Dar, found that this management was happening long before the goats actually looked like domestic goats. The DNA of these ancient goats shows a management signature that predates physical changes by centuries. Humans were controlling their breeding, protecting them from wolves, and leading them to better pastures. The goats, in turn, became more docile because the aggressive ones were the first to be eaten by the humans. It was a slow, mutual entrapment. We became slaves to their needs, protecting them, feeding them, moving them, just so we could have a guaranteed source of protein. We didn't invent the herd, we just became its most useful parasite. This wasn't a triumph of the human spirit, it was a desperate response to a world that was no longer providing for us. And then things got truly weird with the cats. If dogs and goats were about safety and food, cats were about the unexpected consequences of our own success. When we started storing grain, we created the first artificial plague: rodents. Mice and rats descended on human settlements in numbers that would have been biblically terrifying. And right behind the mice came the Near Eastern wildcat. Unlike wolves, cats were never social. They didn't have a pack hierarchy for us to hijack. They were solitary, lethal, and completely indifferent to us. They moved into our villages because that's where the food was. We tolerated them because they were the only things standing between us and a famine caused by grain-thieving rats. The relationship was entirely transactional. We didn't tame cats. They moved in and we just didn't kick them out. Genetic studies show that domestic cats are barely different from their wild ancestors. They didn't go through the same radical physical restructuring that dogs did because they never needed to work for us. Their only job was to exist and kill things. In 2004, a 9,500-year-old grave in Cyprus was found containing a human buried with a cat. Cyprus had no native wildcats. That means someone, nearly 10,000 years ago, cared enough about a cat to put it on a boat and bring it to an island. This is the moment where utility turns into attachment. We weren't just managing biological assets anymore. We were forming emotional bonds with creatures that, only a few thousand years prior, would have been seen as nothing more than vermin or competition. But why did some cultures go so much further? Why did the horse change everything? The horse is the ultimate example of the directed pathway. This wasn't an accident, and it wasn't a slow crawl. By the time we got to horses, we already knew the rules of the game. We had dogs, goats, and cattle. We understood that animals could be ours. But the horse was a different beast entirely. It was fast, it was powerful, and it was terrified of us. For a long time, we thought the Butai culture in Kazakhstan were the first horse lords around 3500 BC. They milked them, they corralled them, they ate them. But recent DNA evidence from a 2021 study led by Ludovic Orlando revealed a shocking twist. The Butai horses aren't the ancestors of our modern horses. They were a dead end. Our modern horses all come from a single, tiny population in the Pontic-Caspian steppe, near the Volga and Don rivers, around 2000 BC. This group of horses had two specific genetic mutations that changed human history. One mutation made their backs stronger, and the other made them less anxious. These were the super horses. Once humans found this specific population, the expansion was explosive. Within a few centuries, these horses and the people who rode them had spread across Eurasia, replacing almost all other horse lineages. This wasn't a slow coevolution, it was a technological breakout. The horse became the first high-speed vehicle, the first mobile weapon of war. It didn't just change how we moved, it changed who ruled. It created empires. It allowed a single group of people to project power across thousands of miles. The horse is the point where domestication stops being about survival and starts being about conquest. Yet, there is a dark side to this success that we rarely talk about. Every time we brought an animal closer to us, we brought their shadows too. Most of the diseases that have nearly wiped out humanity, measles, smallpox, the flu, tuberculosis, are zoonotic. They are gifts from our domestic partners. Measles came from cattle. The flu came from birds and pigs. Smallpox likely jumped from camels or cows. Before domestication, humans lived in small, mobile groups. We weren't dense enough for a virus to sustain an epidemic. But once we settled down with our animals, we created the perfect incubator. We were living in their waste, breathing their air, and drinking their milk. We traded our health for a stable food supply. It was a Faustian bargain. We got the city, the empire, and the cat on the lap, but we also got the Black Death and the 1918 pandemic. We are still paying the interest on that loan today. But perhaps the most unsettling realization is that the fence goes both ways. There is a growing body of evidence suggesting that we didn't just domesticate the animals. We domesticated ourselves. This is the self-domestication hypothesis, championed by researchers like Richard Wrangham at Harvard. If you compare a modern human skull to the skull of a human from 50,000 years ago, the changes are strikingly familiar. Our faces are flatter. Our brow ridges are reduced. Our brains have actually shrunk slightly in volume. These are the exact same physical markers we see in domestic dogs versus wolves, or domestic pigs versus wild boars. The theory is that early human societies, much like the early human camps selecting for calm wolves, began to select for calm humans. In a world where survival depended on complex cooperation, the hyper-aggressive, alpha male types were a liability. They were dangerous to the group. So, over tens of thousands of years, we began to weed them out. We killed the bullies. We exiled the uncontrollably violent. We preferred the friendly collaborators. By doing so, we triggered the same domestication syndrome in our own biology. We became more docile, more cooperative, and physically softer. We are the friendly version of the genus Homo. We didn't just build the cage for the animals. We walked inside it and locked the door behind us. So, how did we invent domestication? We didn't. We survived it. It was a series of accidents, desperate pivots, and genetic coincidences that happened to work out. It was a 40,000-year negotiation that transformed a wolf into a pug and a wild, aggressive ape into a creature that writes poetry and builds skyscrapers. We think we are the masters of this story, but the evidence suggests we are just one of the participants. The animals didn't just provide us with meat and labor, they provided us with the social and biological structure that allowed us to become human in the first place. Without the wolf, we might have been wiped out by Neanderthals. Without the goat and the grain, we would still be scattered in the woods. Without the horse, we would never have seen the other side of the mountain. But there is one final piece of evidence that suggests our control over this process is even thinner than we realize. It brings us back to the very beginning, to that first moment of contact. We like to think we chose the animals, but the deeper we look, the more it seems like the animals were the ones who saw the opportunity. They saw a messy, loud, fire-wielding primate and realized that if they could just tolerate our presence, they would never have to hunt in the cold again. They hacked our biology. They used our trash to fuel their evolution. And they did it so well that we eventually forgot they were ever our equals. The ultimate proof of this isn't in a lab or a textbook, it's in the ground. In that 14,000-year-old grave in Bonn-Oberkassel, researchers found a puppy that had been sick with distemper for weeks before it died. That puppy was useless. It couldn't hunt, it couldn't guard, and it was a drain on the group's resources. Yet the humans kept it alive. They cleaned it, they fed it, and they stayed with it through its suffering. That wasn't an invention. That was a surrender. We had stopped seeing the wolf as a tool and started seeing it as a part of ourselves. We live in a world that is almost entirely domestic. Most of the mammalian biomass on Earth is now either humans or our livestock. Only a tiny fraction is truly wild. We have reshaped the planet into a giant farm, a giant kennel, and a giant stable. But in our rush to claim credit for this transformation, we have overlooked the most haunting fact of all. We didn't tame the world to make it ours. We tamed it because we were afraid of being alone in the dark. And now, 40,000 years later, we have exactly what we asked for. We have the safety, we have the food, and we have the companions. But we are also more dependent on those tame creatures than they are on us. If they disappeared tomorrow, we would follow them into oblivion within weeks. It's a sobering thought to realize that our greatest achievement was actually a slow-motion surrender to the very things we thought we were conquering. We didn't just change the animals, we allowed the animals to change us. And that change is permanent. It's written into our bones, our skulls, and our very DNA. We are the architects of a world we don't fully control, living in a partnership we didn't fully plan, alongside creatures that remember a version of us we have long since forgotten. The story of domestication isn't a story of human triumph. It's a story of how the wild found a way to survive by becoming the one thing we couldn't bring ourselves to kill. This brings us to a final, inescapable truth about our place in the world. We look at the animals in our lives, the dog at our feet, the cow in the field, and we see our own ingenuity reflected back at us. But that's a mirror we built to hide the reality. The reality is that the great invention of domestication was actually the longest, most successful ambush in the history of life. We think we brought the wolf into the light of the fire to serve us. But looking at the state of the world today, it's clear the wolf was the one who knew exactly what it was doing. The haunting proof of our shared history isn't found in our cities or our technology, but in a small, 14,000-year-old molar from a sick puppy buried with its owners. That tooth shows that long before we were masters of the earth, we were already vulnerable to the simple, irrational need for a creature that could do nothing for us. We were already compromised. We didn't win the battle for domestication. We lost the battle against our own loneliness, and we've been living with the consequences and the companions ever since. Think about that the next time you look into the eyes of a dog. You aren't looking at a creature we created. You are looking at the descendant of the animal that saw us at our most desperate and decided we were worth the effort. They stayed when they could have left, and in doing so, they ensured we would never be the same again. We didn't invent them. They invented us. And they're still watching, just like they were 40,000 years ago, waiting to see what we'll do next with the world they helped us build. This is the reality of the human story. It's not a story of dominance, but of a deep, ancient, and often terrifying entanglement. We are a domestic species living in a domestic world, forever tied to the ghosts of the wild things that decided to walk beside us. If you want to know how we really invented domestication, the answer is simple: we didn't. We just left the scraps out, and we were never the same again. Now that you know the truth, does it feel like we're the ones in charge, or are we just the most successful servants the animal kingdom has ever known? Subscribing for more deep dives into the hidden history of our world won't change the fact that you're a self-domesticated ape, but at least you'll understand why your cat is currently judging you from the other side of the room. The truth is often more haunting than the myth, and in the case of domestication, the truth is that we are the ones who were taken in. We are the ones who were changed. And we are the ones who can no longer survive without the tame world we claim to have built. The fire is still burning, the scraps are still there, and the wolf, in its many forms, is still sitting right beside us, waiting.